Elian. Okay. Miriam, Elian, Jakob,
Yep.
and Suki. Suki, I haven't met you before. Are you registered in this class?
Actually, I'm a TA. I was in your class winter sem last year.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. Well, welcome back. What are you doing your studies in?
Undergrad, majoring in psychology, minoring in bioscience.
Perfect. Well, welcome back. All right.
Okay.
So today is a very full lecture, so we will get going. The nature of space medicine is that it is changing very rapidly, so I update the slides every semester. I do for most of the lectures I give, which means that we just grab more and more slides into the time we have together. We likely won't get through it, but I will highlight the midterm points, and just remember that every midterm question that I give you will be open book, okay? And then again, remember that this is meant to be a discussion to help inform your own studies, so some of it will be more relevant to you than other aspects of it. So at any time, just pause and ask questions, okay? Just because I want you to get as much of it as possible, okay? And if there's parts that we don't get to, don't worry about it. Everything there is to inform your interest in technology and the future of medicine, specifically as it points to space medicine. So let's get going, unless there's questions before we start. All right, okay, so today you already know about my background. I'm just going to highlight a few aspects of my own background within the context of space and austere environments, so you know why I'm giving this lecture. So I'm the director of the International Institute for Astronautical Sciences Space Medicine Group. It's an organization and not-for-profit that I've worked with for 9 years now. I have completed their Citizen Scientist Astronaut Program graduate training. I've tested spacesuits with them, different types of spacesuits, intravehicular activity, IVA spacesuits, those are the blue and orange ones, and extravehicular activity spacesuits. EVA spacesuits, these are the white ones that you see on spacewalks during the Apollo era, or when astronauts are doing work outside the space station. I am an aquanaut. I've done 2 underwater missions, and I've also been in different flight environments, including hypergravity and microgravity, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. But suffice to say, I have a lot of experience and a lot of background in this area. We'll talk a little bit about immersive technologies, but I'm actually going to defer most of that to the dedicated lecture on immersive medicine, just for the sake of time. I work with a couple of other commercial space companies. I'm a medical strategic research advisor to Above Space Development Corporation. That means nothing to you right now. It will mean more when I explain that a little bit later this lecture. I run the AAIS Space Medicine class, and I'm a medical advisor to a space food company called Astrius. Okay, so by the end of this lecture, I want you to get a sense of why space medicine is a field, what the hazards of the spaceflight environment are, how we pack for space, the challenges of actually preparing for hazards in space, what emerging technologies and challenges exist within the field of space medicine, and how we prepare for the spaceflight environment through like or analog test beds on Earth. So away we go. Let's start with the question first. So hypothetical scenario, imagine that you were going to the moon today and you are the crew physician. So what are you going to pack with you? So in order to answer that question, we need to know what we're packing for, and that involves understanding the challenges of the spaceflight environment. So there's multiple ways to think about survival. So this, those of you with a psychology background will have seen this. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, starting with survival all the way up to self-actualization. I would argue that in 2024, we need Wi-Fi as a base. Without, I don't know what you, but I personally can't survive without Wi-Fi. But on a more serious note, when we talk about the challenges of the spaceflight environment, it's a whole laundry list of challenges that include increased radiation. So the higher up we go, the more radiation we have to contend with. It includes being able to deal with different acceleration loads. So with launch and landing, we're dealing with hypergravity forces. So all of us right now are in a 1G or 1 gravity environment. There's altered day-night cycles depending on where you are. So at the level of the International Space Station, which will be kind of our frame of reference for the first part of this lecture, we are in low Earth orbit at 250 miles, about 400 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. At that altitude, you are going through 1 revolution every 90 minutes. That means you're experiencing 16 sunrises per 24-hour period. So suffice to say, your day-night cycles are a little bit thrown off. You're working in a very operational, tightly scheduled environment. Astronauts on the ISS are famously scheduled down to the to the 5-minute mark. And it's also a very confined space. So you have to be able to get along well with others. You have to be able to deal with a very noisy, high vibration environment. You have to be able to get work done in that environment. And you have to also have good interpersonal dynamics. Nobody wants to be that astronaut that's voted off the space station because they don't get along with everyone else. There's concerns with some of the more technical aspects of space. So for those of you who are divers, you may have heard about decompression sickness. So that's when we go from a high pressure environment to a low pressure environment. So when you're a diver, you're surfacing quickly, and the nitrogen bubbles that have been dissolved in your blood, if you don't ascend slowly enough, those nitrogen bubbles will come out of solution and lodge in places where they shouldn't, like your joints, causing pain, or in worst case scenarios, in your lungs, your brain, in your heart, causing heart attack, seizure, coma, or death, all of which is bad. Where that becomes relevant to the spaceflight environment is when we send astronauts on spacewalks, we put them from a normal 1 atmosphere environment on the ISS to a slightly lower pressure environment in the spacesuit when they go on a spacewalk, just because if we pressurize the spacesuit at a higher pressure, it actually becomes really hard to fight against the suit. So there's a lower pressure gradient, so astronauts without countermeasures are at risk of experiencing decompression illness. We also need to trust the engineering of our spacecraft to protect us from the high radiation vacuum environment of space and its temperature extremes. And at the same time, trust the shielding of that spacecraft to be strong enough to withstand impacts from micrometeoroid and orbital debris, as well as to have adequate radiation shielding. We need to trust the engineering of our enclosed loop life support systems, or ECLIS, to keep the atmosphere within habitable confines. So adequate temperature, humidity, pressure control, as well as scrubbing. So scrubbing the atmosphere of particulate matter, of CO2, carbon dioxide buildup, of off-gassing from compounds. And then there's, of course, everyday medical conditions which we might encounter on Earth. So lumps and bumps, traumas, abrasions, illness. And then, of course, all of this hasn't even mentioned the big thing that we think of when we talk about space, which is, of course, microgravity or weightlessness. So the summary of this slide is that every single bodily system is affected by the spaceflight environment. So our bones lose density without countermeasures, and we'll talk about what countermeasures we undertake in a few slides. Our bones lose mass, our fluids shift upwards. So this also has effects for everything from the appearance of our face. So I think I have this on the next slide. Yeah, you can see here in the 1G condition, this is what astronaut Dr. Chakramakai's face looks like. With a fluid shift, she takes on a moon face appearance. So it's rounder, it's more full, it's puffy. And the other consequence of that is that astronauts feel like they're congested. So food, as a consequence, they have less taste. So food has to be more palatable, more textured, more spicy, more flavorful. The other consequence that becomes important with this fluid shift is that when we come back down to Earth, the fluid that has previously been shifted upwards comes back down to our feet. And so our veins are decompensated, which our veins normally push blood back to our hearts. And with that decompensation of the veins, when you stand up for the first time in the 1G environment, you can actually, all the blood will rush to your feet, you can feel faint. So when you see an astronaut coming back to Earth after a landing, they're carried out and they're covered with garlands, and part of it's ceremony and pomp and circumstance, but most of it's safety, so they're not fainting. Coming back to the slide, our inner ears, our balance system is also thrown off. So the way we perceive balance on Earth is this delicate coordination between the proprioceptors in our skin, what our eyes perceive, and what our inner ears perceive as up, down, side to side. So there's this mismatch when we get to the 0G environment. And so what happens is that in certain cases, astronauts can get really sick. It's called space adaptation syndrome, and they can get very nauseated and throw up in the 0G environment, which is both gross, but also impedes their ability to do critical tasks. So for that first week on station, astronauts won't be subjected to critical tasks like a spacewalk. And you can even kind of do an experiment right now to just see what that coordination looks like. If you were to close your eyes and then stick your finger out in front of you, and then I were to ask you to touch your nose with your eyes closed, you might miss unless you practice. I've done this enough times that I know where my nose is, but the first time I ask people to do it, sometimes they miss. So then the final consequence that we'll talk about today is what happens to our cerebrospinal fluid. That's that proteinaceous brain and spine juice that surrounds our central nervous system. And this is a more recent finding in the history of human spaceflight, kind of being about 15 to 18 years old now. And basically what we've learned is that brain fluid, CSF, does not drain normally like it would in the 1G scenario. And it results in pockets of increased pressure around specific parts of our brains. Especially around the optic nerve as it exits the backs of our eyes and comes into the brain. So that can result into increased pressure on the optic nerve, causing swelling and in certain cases even shifts in vision. And for reasons we don't know, this actually selectively affects male astronauts. We don't have a good countermeasure to this yet, so this is considered one of the big emerging problems in space medicine and a potential showstopper for Mars. So the official name for this term for this condition is called the spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome, and it's a constellation of syndromes that affect the shape of the eyeball, what happens to the back of the eye, the optic nerve, as well as pressure in the brain. And we're still trying to understand exactly how it happens and how we mitigate it. Okay. There are also some observed gender differences between astronauts. So female astronauts, for example, are more prone to bladder infections because of the shorter distance of their urethra. As well as abnormal fluid dynamics in the microgravity environment. So, for example, if you are crying in 1G, your tears will fall down. If you're crying or if you get some debris in your eye, if you can't reach your eye, if you're on a spacewalk, your vision gets blurred and you actually can't see what you're doing, which is an important consideration. And in fact, Chris Hadfield, the Canadian astronaut, has an entire TED talk about how he went blind in space during a spacewalk. So the fluid dynamics are interesting to consider. Coming back to gender differences, there's different, female and male astronauts have different cardiovascular implications. So for example, women are more prone to fainting on Earth after coming back from space due to cardiovascular decompensation, whereas male astronauts are more prone to getting cardiac dysrhythmias on orbit. And then we've already talked about how male astronauts are more prone to getting or susceptible to the spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome. And then interestingly enough, when it comes to cognition and performance, two important points. There's no difference in performance between male and female astronauts. And then studies show that mixed gender crews have less conflict and better overall performance. So here's a slide dedicated to women's health in space, and the summary is that we need more studies. This is another emerging area of interest, especially for me personally in space, because women are grossly underrepresented in spaceflight. So only 11 to 12% of the 600 plus astronauts to date have been women, and less than 1% have been black women. So here's kind of the history of who went to space, and there's of course that famous or infamous incident when Sally Ride was the first American woman in space, and she was subjected to a lot of misogynistic and sexist questions. She was asked if she would take makeup to space. NASA thought, hey, initially said, is 200 tampons enough? And then when she just questioned that, they said, okay, we've revised the calculation. We'll give you 100 tampons, and then she kind of let them know that's not what she needs for a 1-week mission. For menstruation period management, it's also understudied because most women astronauts tend to go on oral contraceptives so as to not have a period in space. Part of that is preference, part of that is engineering. So blood famously clogs up the International Space Station toilet. So my argument is let's just engineer a better toilet than engineering the female astronauts. So that's another area to do better in space medicine. And then reproduction in human spaceflight, we'll talk a little bit more about later because that's also one of my areas of study. Okay, so we've kind of talked about gender-based health effects. So I won't go over too much of this. This is more for your interest here. One practical issue that comes up is just the proportions of and differences between women and men, especially on spacewalks. So there's different fits of spacesuit. There's small, there's medium, and there's different sizing, but the proportion is still more geared towards male astronauts. So women can be more prone to injuries and pressure points from the spacesuit. So spacesuit design also needs to adapt to be able to allow women astronauts to perform better. Yeah, so that's about all I'll say on that. We've covered most of this verbally already. Okay, and then here's a good survey if you want to read more on the topic. So there will be a lot of extra papers, links to extra papers, and it's the intent isn't that you read all of them. It's more that if you're interested in a particular area of space medicine, whether it's AI, 3D printing, computational science, gender differences, you have a starting point to look at. So it's not that the intent isn't that you read every single one of these studies. So for example, a few years ago, we had a dentistry student who specifically asked for slides on dentistry in space. So here's a whole bunch of further reading, and suffice to say that there are known issues, for example, when we go from pressure changes and increased G loads. The astronauts need to be screened thoroughly for what are their fillings, what is their dental history, how much of a risk are they for getting, a loose filling or something, a dental emergency. The crew medical officer is trained to drain a dental abscess so that it doesn't affect the mission. So here's some further reading on dentistry in space. And what's really interesting and cool about space medicine is the field just keeps expanding and drawing in more disciplines. So this is a really comprehensive study from 2017 that appeared in Science, and it is called the NASA Twin Study. So there's two astronauts, Scott and Mark Kelly. They're identical twins. They're both Navy pilots. They're both NASA astronauts. And famously, Scott Kelly spent a year in space, and his brother Mark spent a year on Earth, and they compared everything from epigenetics to DNA methylation to proteomics to metabolomics to cognitive performance to his immune system and his gut microbiome. And it's a really cool paper if you're interested. Interestingly enough, Scott Kelly was the first person to administer a vaccine in space. He gave himself the flu shot to test his immune response because we know that the immune system is suppressed in the spaceflight environment, and so we were able to, the scientists were able to show that he mounted an appropriate immune response. And then there were other conflicting findings. So for example, there was a difference in his gut microbiome post, initially post-flight, and then it returned to its pre-flight baseline by 6 months post-flight. So the link should be here. If not, you just look up Google NASA Twin Study to find out more. But what's revolutionary about this is how multidisciplinary this whole paper was. Like if you look at the author's byline, it has everyone from every single possible discipline as it pertains to space health and physiology. So the surprises keep coming. This is why space medicine is such an interesting field, because the more people we send to space, the more we build on studies that were done previously, the more we find out. So in 2019, during routine handheld ultrasound experiments where astronauts visualized their jugular veins, as a total surprise, one of the astronauts found that they had a thrombus, or a giant clot in their jugular vein, which is not ideal, can be life-threatening, and they had to start them on blood thinners or anticoagulation. So then that also brings a new dimension to consider. Does being in space lend itself to a or hypercoagulable state, or one in which astronauts are more likely to experience blood clots? And if that's the case, well, how do we mitigate that? Through selection, through treatment, and through screening. This is a study from a Canadian group last year that looked at, we know that red blood cells are diluted in spaceflight, and we need more information about how that's happening. So they found that red blood cell breakdown was a part of that constellation. So all of this is to say that, if you remember nothing else from this first introduction to the hazards of spaceflight, is simply that space is trying to kill you. So and there's more papers here. Here's a good review from a group. I'm not sure where this group is from, but it looks at the state of the art increased in 2023. Okay. Any questions so far from this first part of the lecture? It's a lot, I know. The only thing you need to know is what about space medicine interests me. It's not to memorize every aspect, and it's to know, and we're going to summarize how we look at the challenges in a little bit. Okay, so the other important thing to know is this is just low Earth orbit. This is just all of the data that we know from staying relatively close to Earth. So then we need to ask the question, well, what happens when we go further and beyond low Earth orbit, and then why are we asking that question? This is a very relevant and timely question. If you follow human spaceflight, if you follow the news, you know that NASA and the international community have very real plans to send humans back to the moon and beyond, starting with Artemis and Lunar Gateway. So this is humanity's first deep space station. So Lunar Gateway will be a smaller space station than the International Space Station. It will be in orbit around the moon. It will not be continuously crewed, unlike the ISS, which always has someone on it. And its mandate is to start construction in a few years. And its mandate is to help with Earth observation, Sun observation, Moon observation, as well as serve as a way station for the Artemis missions, which are, of course, the international community and NASA's plans to send humans to the moon, starting with and sending the first person of color to the moon. So Artemis 1 was an uncrewed mission that launched in 2022, I think, 2021, and it was a proof of concept to prove that the vehicle could circumnavigate the moon, and it also had some experiments that looked at radiation levels. Artemis 2 will be taking place in 2025. It will be a crew of 4. What is really exciting is that for the first time, a non-American will be part of that crew, and in fact, it is a Canadian. So Jeremy Hansen, Christina Cook, Victor Glover, and Reed Wiseman will be part of that crew. They will be circumnavigating the moon again, and then Artemis 3 will be sending humans back to the moon for the first time. And the whole goal of the Artemis mission, in addition to going back to the moon, is exploration, science, and then establishing permanent surface operations on the moon, but also importantly, serving as a testing bed for Mars. So I hope it's becoming apparent why we need to start thinking about the space medicine challenges beyond low Earth orbit. So let's talk a little bit about that now. And it's not just the space agencies who are going back to the moon and beyond. The commercial sector is very interested. So SpaceX and Blue Origin are contracted by NASA and the international community for launch vehicles to the moon and for landers. And then Elon Musk has famously said he wants to send humans to Mars permanently. So again, there's a lot of interest in sending humans beyond low Earth orbit. So what is our data pool? What do we know about deep space? The answer is very little. We have basically what we know from the Apollo missions in the 60s and 70s. So let's talk a little bit about that now. So in addition to everything we've talked about for the challenges of spaceflight for radiation, for microgravity, we know that lunar dust was a very potent skin, respiratory, and eye irritant from the Apollo missions. It was just so fine. It's electromagnetically charged. I think it has a negative charge, so it just got everywhere. It stuck to the suits. It got clogged in the joints, and then if astronauts got it on their persons, it was irritating. So there's a pretty good review that came back out of Nature Microgravity last year that talks about the overview of lunar dust toxicity. And it's one of the considerations as we look towards the Artemis missions about how to mitigate lunar dust toxicity. All right, so let's return to radiation. The reason I left it for this part is because it's more of a consideration for deep space. So the summary is, when we talk about radiation, the higher up we go, the more radiation we have to contend with. So ISS is still within the protective confines of low Earth orbit. That means, within the protective confines of the Van Allen belts. These are electromagnetic belts that filter out higher energy ionizing radiation. So that means solar particle events, solar flares, and background galactic cosmic radiation up here. Most of that is filtered out at the level of the ISS. That's not the case when we talk about going further. So here's a really good summary cartoon from the European Space Agency. So if we take being exposed to background radiation at surface level, where we are at sea level, where we all are now, let's take that as 1 unit. If you're flying commercially at the altitude of a transatlantic flight, you are exposed to about 40 times what you'd be exposed to at sea level. When you're at the level of the International Space Station, 250-fold. So that's almost a year's equivalent of radiation exposure as that you would get in a single day aboard the ISS. And then it's 700-fold when you talk about a deep space journey to the moon and Mars. And remember, it's also higher energy ionizing radiation. So that's one consideration. And then we also look at how different organs are affected by radiation because there's different sensitivities. So blood-forming organs, our bone marrow, our eyes, our reproductive organs are more sensitive. And then there's annual limits as well as career limits. So those are also considerations when we talk about deep space missions and the duration of these missions. So what's really interesting, for example, when we look at recommendations for annual exposure to blood-forming organs, it's 0.5 sieverts, whereas we look at historically what has happened on Space Shuttle, Apollo, Skylab, and Mir missions. On a long-duration 1-year Mir mission, that exposure was actually, the annual limit was actually exceeded. So it is something that needs to be mitigated through radiation shielding, and we'll talk a little bit more about mitigation towards the end of this lecture. The next consideration is communication. So is anyone here a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy fan? Or no? Okay. So there's this quote from Douglas Adams. If you're a science fiction fan, I encourage you to look into it. But Douglas Adams basically writes that space is big, so vastly, hugely, mind-bogglingly big you wouldn't believe it. And basically the distances that we have to contend with in space are such that even traveling at the speed of light, there's a communication delay. So when we talk about Earth and Moon, the round-trip communication delay is about 2.4 seconds. So it's not, it's noticeable, but it's not impossible to have a communication, even if there's an emergency. Depending on the alignment of Earth and Mars, that round-trip communication delay can be 6 to 48 minutes. So if you don't have medical training and now you have a mass hemorrhage, a trauma, or cardiac arrest on Mars, and you're trying to radio back for help on Earth, it could be 23 minutes before you even hear back for further instruction, which could be too late. So that is a lot. So all you need to know from this part of the lecture is the summary framework for how we think about considerations in space flight for long duration missions and for exploration class missions. So we call this the RIDGE framework. This part probably will come up on the midterm. There is definitely a space medicine question. So when we talk about RIDGE, we talk about radiation, we talk about isolation and confinement. Remember, we're talking about sending humans to Mars, which is about 6 to 9 months away, depending on the alignment of the two planets. Distance from Earth, we talked about the communication challenges. Altered gravity, we've already talked about how the human body adapts or doesn't adapt in microgravity. We haven't talked about the gravity environments on Earth, on Moon and Mars. So on the Moon, it's 1/6 gravity. If you weigh 100 pounds on Earth, you weigh 17 pounds on the Moon, and you weigh 38 pounds on Mars. So the challenge there is we know a lot about how we've all adapted in 1G. We have 4.7 billion years of data to show us how we've adapted to 1G. We have about 60 plus years of data showing what humans do in the microgravity environment. We don't know what happens in the 1/6 gravity environment or the 1/3 gravity environment. Because if we send humans to the Moon and we find that, hey, a lot of those challenges that we've talked about in 0G are actually mitigated in 1/6G, that's really reassuring for sending humans to Mars, which is 1/3G. If they're not mitigated, then we still have to solve the challenge about what happens to the spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome, what happens to our bones, our muscles in 0G on a 9-month journey to Mars. So coming to the E of hostile environment, that just encompasses everything else. So we've talked about lunar dust. We talked about altered day-night cycles at the level of the ISS. So at the level of the Moon, it really depends on where you are. At the lunar equator, the day-night cycle is 14 days of day, 14 days of night. On Mars, the Martian day is 24 and a half hours. So it's close to Earth, but it's a little bit longer. Any questions? All right. Okay, so moving along. So coming back to the initial question, we talked about being the crew doctor for a lunar mission. We talked about, well, what do you pack knowing that there's all of these hazards for the spaceflight environment and that space is trying to kill you? So we might be a little bit stressed. So let's talk now about the tools that we have at our disposal and how we actually prepare for space. So risk mitigation and prevention is so key. So if anyone here has taken an engineering course or has worked in an engineering setting, you might recognize this as an engineering risk matrix. So when we talk about projects and how we approach risk, we look at the consequence and the likelihood of something happening. If something's high risk, high likelihood to happen, we need to mitigate it before the mission can go forward, just to help protect the mission and the lives of the astronauts as well as their health. If something is very low likelihood to occur and low consequence, we probably won't dedicate resources, time, and money towards mitigating it. So this prevention starts at selection. So space agency astronauts are very famously rigorously selected. I like to say that being a space agency astronaut is somewhat a bit of a medical genetic lottery because the selection includes very strict medical, physiological, and psychological screening. And then it continues with pre, post, and in-flight risk management. So there's personalized rehabilitation schedules for building up muscle mass, just to prevent that muscle mass and bone density loss that happens in flight. It continues in flight. Astronauts on the International Space Station are famously subjected to about 2 hours of aerobic and resistive exercise on space station 5 to 6 days a week. So just to kind of break that down a little bit more, you might be saying, well, how are they running in space? There's no gravity. So there's actually a treadmill on the International Space Station, and astronauts tether themselves to it. So astronaut Sunita Williams famously ran the Boston Marathon in 4 hours while she was up there. And your fun bit of trivia is that the treadmill is called the Colbert after the late night show host, Stephen Colbert, because he had his fans vote overwhelmingly to name a brand new ISS module after him, and NASA said, well, we can't do that. So as a compromise, they retroactively, or they backronymed the Colbert treadmill, so it stands for the Combined Load-Bearing Ergonomic Resistance Trainer. So that's one fun bit of trivia. So if you're wondering about the resistive exercise part, you also might be saying, how are you lifting weights in microgravity? We can all bench 600 pounds in 0G because it's not weightless. So the weight machine system is based on resistive hydraulics in space. So you can actually perform squats and weight and resistive exercise through that resistive hydraulic system. It's called the Advanced Resistive Device System, AREDS. Okay, so it continues with, when we talk about astronaut health and keeping astronauts healthy, this continues with post-flight rehab. So remember, we talked about how astronauts are decompensated post-flight, so then they have tailored rehabilitation profiles for building up that muscle mass, getting that bone density loss back. Continues with monitoring, nutrition, pre-flight quarantine. NASA was doing it before COVID made it cool, just so they don't bring any germs up to the space station. So remember, we talked about immune systems being suppressed in space, and the other part of it is that germs are found to be more virulent in space. So if you don't bring COVID up to ISS, that's always a good thing. In terms of in-situ medical capabilities, there is a crew medical officer on the International Space Station. There's not guaranteed to be a doctor. So CMO training used to be 40 to 60 hours. Now it's about 15 to 20 hours. And it can include things like airway management, IV starts, dental abscesses. And to help them out on the ISS, there is a medical kit, medication, procedures, and protocols. Okay, so we've covered some of this. So this is a snapshot of what the crew healthcare system, the check system on the ISS looks like. So we talked about monitoring and prevention. We talked about the exercise measures that are up there. And then as a tertiary prevention method, that's treatment, which we'll show you some pictures of what the kits look like. And in terms of the packs that they have up there, we'll talk a little bit about packing for space, but basically there's airway management, medication packs, there's a crew medical restraint system. So if you have a sick patient, you can't just treat them floating there. You need to restrain them, so there's a system to keep them down, to help tether them down. And then there's also telemedicine capabilities because they have real-time communication, so they can communicate back with if the flight surgeon back on Earth. So that's all I want to say about that. Okay. And then in terms of the support crew, there are a lot. There is a lot, and there's a lot of disciplines involved with keeping astronauts healthy and high-performing up in space. So there's 24/7 international flight surgeon support. So there will always be Capcom, there will be a mission controller who's communicating with the astronauts. It'll be someone from there will always be someone on console from the 5 partner agencies that are responsible for operating the International Space Station. So that's the European Space Agency, the Canadian Space Agency, NASA, Roscosmos in Russia, and the European Space Agency. And so there will always be a flight surgeon on call. There will be multiple disciplines involved with astronaut health, everything from occupational health, aerospace medicine, psychologists, nutritionists, physiologists. It's a very long list. Okay, so let's now talk about the computer models that help us with decision making and risk management. So this was an early model of how we helped plan our crew medical kit contents. It's called the IMM, or the Integrated Medical Model. This comes out of the XMC, or the Exploration Medical Capability at Johnson Space Center. And basically what IMM does is it looks at what do we have for medical kit contents on the International Space Station, how much of each supply, what do we have, and then it lets us extrapolate a different mission profile. So if we're saying we're sending 4 people for 9 months to an asteroid, it lets us take in the size of the crew, the duration of the mission, and then it also lets us input how much risk are we willing to accept for loss of mission, loss of crew, loss of evacuation, and how healthy do we want the crew to be overall. And so then that lets us generate a medical kit based on what has happened on ISS and what the contents are there. So if we pause and think about that for a second, you might be saying, well, what if you're using the same antibiotic for a bladder infection, but then you have a respiratory infection and then a skin infection? You've depleted your resources. I'm glad you asked. So there's a follow-up computer model to that. We'll come back to this in a second, called the MedPrat. This is the Medical Extensible Dynamic Probability Risk Assessment Tool. You don't need to memorize that, but we call it the MedPrat for short because it's really hard to say. So it's based on neural networks, and it's a lot more dynamic in that it allows us to account for countermeasures at different time points during a mission, as well as fixes, as well as additional events. So it's a lot more complex and dynamic, and so we can actually generate a variety of end states based on what has happened and based on different probabilities. So that is the next evolution after the integrated medical model. So the other thing we need to know about is, what are we packing for? Do we need to pack for a C-section in space? Probably not. The better measure would be to just make sure that no one gets pregnant in space by making sure that we're doing pregnancy tests pre-flight. There are pregnancy test kits on the ISS, and the answer would probably be just to end the mission and bring an astronaut home. So we actually, when we talk about what we pack for, this is the XMC's list of top 100 medical conditions in spaceflight. So this includes very common everyday things like congestion headaches from fluid shifts, CO2 headaches. So what happens, the other interesting part about being in the zero-G environment is convection doesn't happen like it would in 1G. So if you're sleeping and you're breathing out CO2, it doesn't just convect away, it just pockets in front of your face. And you can get a CO2 headache from the vasoconstriction associated with that. So those are everyday things, but it also includes emergencies like cardiac arrest, mass hemorrhage, things that would be life or death. And that's what informs our medical kit contents. And then of course, it's also informed by historically what has happened in spaceflight. And the good news is that typically what happens in space is the annoying stuff, but not the life-threatening stuff. So that space adaptation syndrome that we talked about, it can be injuries, trauma, lumps and bumps, it can be skin infections, respiratory infections, inability to sleep. Interestingly, maybe I think I took it out, but on a different version of this table, we see cardiac dysrhythmias happen, but luckily they happen to be asymptomatic and self-limited. So our hearts misbehave in space, but it goes away and it doesn't bother us, at least based on information so far. Okay. So the next evolution of computer modeling tools is impact. And along with that, direct acyclic graphs. And so this is now a more holistic way of looking at, a holistic and operational way of looking at what can happen in space, and then how can that be related to other conditions and the spaceflight environment. So for example, if we're looking at the risk of psychiatric disorders or behavioral disorders, we look at the hazard, we look at things that can contribute to it, like radiation and being far away from Earth and being isolated and confined. We can look at the risks, contributing factors. So for example, being under a rigorous training schedule, not getting along with our crewmates. And then we can look at risks from a human level, as well as how that might impact the mission. So it can impact the team, it can impact health, and then it also talks about mitigation measures. So everything that we talk about in terms of modeling is increasingly complex and builds on the work before it. Okay, so this is just to let you know about how we're using computer modeling in spaceflight and how it's evolved. Okay, so we talked about what goes wrong in space. We've talked about our tools. So the next question we need to ask is not what will we pack, how will we pack? So let's talk about the challenges of packing for spaceflight. So famously, we only have so much space in space. So we call this the backpacking principle. So if you're an avid camper, outdoors person, you know this principle. You can only bring so much with you. If you're a hiker, you can only bring with you what you're carrying in your backpack. You only have so much volume and so much weight. Everything comes at the expense of something else. So it's very similar in spaceflight. I like to call it the LABMP principle, in that it takes phenomenal cosmic power to get there. Once you get there, it's itty bitty living space. So when we talk about design principles for space, memorize this slide. It will come up on the midterm. And we talk about the design principles of needing to be low cost, low volume, low mass, ideally low power, because we only have finite power on the spacecraft. Ideally easy to use, so it has to not be very intensive in terms of training time for astronauts to use. Astronaut time is at a premium. And also it has to have a long shelf life. It can't be, succumb easily to radiation. So again, start the slide, memorize it, think about how it will come up on the midterm, because it will. And historically, the reason I emphasize this is because this is probably one of the most poorly done questions on the midterm, because even though all I want you to do is use these principles to answer the question, everyone seems to forget that. So this time I want to say it loud, know this slide, use it to answer your space medicine questions. Okay, so then we also need to think about integration. Are there any questions so far? Okay, so when we also need to talk about integration. So we talked about the astronaut. We've talked a little bit about the ancillary factors, but like looking at the big picture, we talked about the engineering aspects, trusting the life support systems, talking about the engineering of the spacecraft. We talked a little bit about clinical and who supports the astronaut team. So let's talk about everything in between now. We need to consider human performance, so we need to talk about focus and fatigue and recognizing what can negatively impact human performance, and then how that impacts the overall mission objectives, how the environment can either be deleterious or supportive of achieving that mission, and then how that also informs spacecraft and vehicle design, okay? And then we need to also incorporate that into our training scenarios, our emergency scenarios, or survival scenarios. So again, just to the point of the slide is to belabor how integrative we need to be with our thinking when it comes to human spaceflight. Okay, so here is a manifestation of design principles for space. So remember we talked about low mass, low volume, low power, easy to use. So these are an actual picture of the medical kits up on the ISS. So you can see they're very, very compact. They're very modularized, and they're very much made for space. So for example, all of the medications are in the medication kit, so you don't have to go hunting around for it. And then they're very, very packaged. Because say, this is Motrin, this is Advil. Say that you just put 1,000 tablets of Advil in one Ziploc bag, and then you opened it up. It would be flying everywhere on the ISS. So if you look very closely, you have bags in bags in bags just to help with that containment. Okay, so this is the medication bag. This is the airway management bag. It's very easy to find. You have your life support and your life or death medications for cardiac and airway emergencies here. There is a defibrillator on the space station. They have not had to use it yet, which is very good. And then this is another example. I'm not sure which kit this is. I think this is part of the, this looks like an airway, part of the airway kit here. Okay, so there's actually the NASA Johnson Space Center's Human Research Program, HRP, has a very cool website. I've included the link here that includes the risks on the human research roadmap for exploration class missions. So it's a more in-depth, extensive view of what we've talked about within the RIDGE framework, and it's interactive. So we've talked a little bit about, for example, radiation. So here, they've categorized risks by categories, and you can click on them. So for example, they look very specifically at nervous system effects from radiation exposure. And then you can click on it and you can see if it's an open topic or if it's been addressed or how it's been addressed and what they're doing. And so the interesting thing is things like that we wouldn't think about unless we're talking about the integrative aspect of how the human interacts with their environment also come up on this. So there's a risk of being inadequate, incompatible vehicle or habitat design, inadequate human-machine computer interface. So all of this becomes really important in space. So inadequate countermeasures, risk of skills deterioration, risk of osteoporosis. It's a very long list. Okay, so the summary from this part of the presentation is that space is hard, space is expensive, and space is trying to kill us. Okay. So how do we prepare for space, knowing that? And what kind of environments on Earth do we use? So what does the International Space Station have in common with a rural and remote village on Earth, or an underwater research habitat, or a medical deployment in the South or North Pole? And the answer is that they're all examples of remote, resource-limited environments. And so they're analogous in some way to the spaceflight environment. So we call them analog environments. So what do we learn from them when it comes to preparing for spaceflight? So I'm just going to take you through some of my own experiences in analog environments now. So we've talked a lot about the effects of micro and partial gravity, and we should add hypergravity to this as well. So how do we simulate altered gravity without going to space? Parabolic flight is one example. Okay, so when we talk about parabolic flight, we talk about flying in an aircraft in the shape of a parabola. So it's just like going over a roller coaster. When you reach the peak of that roller coaster, your stomach lifts up into your chest, and it's because you're falling at the same rate as your roller coaster. It's the same as when you're going down on an elevator. You feel weightless for a second. So when we're doing this in an aircraft, we are accelerating upwards in a parabola. So because we're accelerating, we feel a 2g pull. And then as we peak over the crest of that parabola, we're falling at the same rate as the aircraft, and we get about 20 seconds of 0g in which to do some science, skills, protocols, or test equipment. So in this case, we've been working with the National Research Council to test the spacesuits and their maneuverability and their hookups in the microgravity environment. So here's a snapshot of what that looks like. I'm not sure if this will play. No. Okay. I'll make sure to include the link from that. So the other interesting thing is when we're flying in parabolic flight, we're not flying any higher than a commercial aircraft. So a transatlantic flight will fly at about 40,000 feet. We're flying at about 17,000 to 19,000 feet when we fly out of the National Research Council. Oh, now it's playing. Okay, just have to go back, see how this works. working in very close teams that we rehearsed a lot. We go over our objectives as a team. We kind of practice in our ground crews. Then we run a dress rehearsal on a grounded aircraft. Then we fly the mission, and then we debrief. And so there's a lot going on, but it's also a lot of fun. So highly recommend it. Okay. But you might be saying, that's only 20 seconds. I'm not impressed. What if you need to do something that requires longer than 20 seconds? Well, I'm glad you asked. So this is another example of how we simulate altered gravity environments. This is a gravity offset harness. So we partnered with the Canadian Space Agency in 2019 with IIS, bless you. And basically in this scenario, we're testing an EVA. Remember, that's the extravehicular activity spacesuit that we use on spacewalks to simulate different gravity environments. So here we've offloaded, this system allows you to offload different percentages of your weight. Here we've offloaded 99% of my weight, so I'm essentially weightless, and now I'm simulating fixing a broken panel outside the International Space Station. We've also been able to simulate 1/3 gravity and 1/6 gravity on the Moon and Mars to test how the spacesuit would act in those scenarios, and also test geologic tools for science in those scenarios. So the trade-off is, you can simulate different gravity environments to take away the time crunch, but it's only whatever's in the harness that's offloaded. So if I drop the hose here, it's still subject to 1G. So it's, there's limitations to every simulation, okay? We have not really talked about hypergravity environments yet, but it's important because that's where a lot of injuries can occur. So when we are accelerating on our rocket for launch, when we're coming back to Earth for landing, those are in hypergravity environments. So we also need to understand how physiology, how spacesuits react in those environments. So we do that through centrifuge studies. So here's me and some of my colleagues at the NASTAR Centrifuge Center in 2016, and basically we are taking part in studies that mimic the flight profile of suborbital spacecraft. Excuse me, to see how different demographics, ages, medical conditions will react in those scenarios. Excuse me, I'm just a bit dry here. Okay, sorry about that. So we also learn a lot about living and working underwater. So here, this is the Orion capsule. This is the spacecraft that will take astronauts to the moon. We have a simulation of the spacecraft at IIS, and basically in these scenarios, we are going through emergency off-nominal landing scenarios. So that's a fancy way of saying crash landing. So in these scenarios, us and our crew, we're simulating egressing from the side or the top of the spacecraft as it lands in water. There was an abort upon launch, and we had to come back to Earth, and then we're just testing how easily we can come out. We can come out as a crew, and then how we can how we work as a crew, and how the spacesuit interfaces with the water to get into our emergency raft in a simulation. Okay, we can, coming back to gravity environments, we can also use buoyancy to help us simulate weightlessness. So NASA famously has the world's largest neutral buoyancy lab at 6.4 million gallons. And so they have a near full-size replica of the entirety of the International Space Station underwater. So astronauts can suit up in their full-size, so they can suit up in their EVA spacesuits and simulate a spacewalk from start to finish while still being on Earth. So we have a baby version of this at the International Institute for Astronomical Sciences. We can simulate the ISS airlock, and with our EVA buddy, we simulate coming out to the ISS and fixing and swapping out a module that needs to be replaced in the near field here, and then using a drill to take it out, and then coming back into the ISS and ingressing. And so the value of this environment is we're essentially, once you achieve neutral buoyancy, you're weightless. And so rather than being limited to 20 seconds of microgravity like in parabolic flight, our runs are about 45 minutes here, and we're limited basically by our oxygen supply, which our safety team is monitoring. And it's a really good way to both practice critical protocols as well as team dynamics and communications in a space-like environment. So we also learn a lot about living and working under the water. Okay, so I mentioned earlier some of my aquanaut experience. So I've been lucky enough to be a part of 2 aquanaut missions at this point, the Neptune and mission called the Nautical Experiments in Physiology, Technology, and Underwater Exploration. I hope it's becoming clear that everything in space and exploration is an acronym. You don't need to remember it all. Basically, over the course of 5 days in 2019, we performed experiments related to technologies and physiological studies that might inform spaceflight and in extreme environments, and then we did the same thing in May of last year. So we were a crew of 5 people, 3 Americans, 2 Canadians, and we did this at the Jules Undersea Lodge in the Florida Keys, so about 20 feet underwater. And if you were to egress out of your habitat, you had to suit up, but in this case, you dive gear to go out into the environment. And the reason we do this is also to build our crew dynamics. So NASA does the very same thing. This is a VR simulation. We'll talk more about this in the VR lecture, so I'll skip over this. But NASA does the same thing at the Aquarius Reef Base, which is also in the Florida Keys, but at 60 feet of depth rather than 20. And they send their astronauts there to become aquanauts over the course of 8 to 16-day missions, again, with a view towards performing science, exploration, and then working in a highly dynamic environment where mistake making can be critical. The other interesting part about living at depth, so when you're at 20 feet of depth for our missions, you're still essentially at surface pressure. So the risk of decompression illness is not that great. You should still be careful and take measures to ascend slowly and safely. But when you're at the Aquarius Reef Base for the NEMO missions, so NEMO stands for NASA Extreme Environment Mission Operations missions, to safely decompress once you are at saturation, once all those nitrogen bubbles have dissolved in your system, you need to decompress for 16 hours and 47 minutes before you can safely ascend. Okay? So if you, by contrast, if you were on the International Space Station and there were a critical emergency like a fire or a medical emergency and you had to evacuate, you could reach Earth in as little as 3 to 6 hours. So you can get definitive medical care more quickly from the ISS than you can from underwater. So I hope it's becoming apparent as to why this would be a good training analog for helping astronauts be independent and self-sufficient in a resource-limited scenario. There are also analogs that replicate different environments. So there's Mars analogs. This is the Mars Desert Research Station in the Utah desert. It looks like Tatooine, but it is actually Utah, and it's an entire Mars habitat with the greenhouse, the greenhouse, the science dome, the habitat, and the observatory. And really, you bring your science and you bring your mission objectives. You live as if you were on Mars, so if you go out, you suit up. So here we are on our EVA. You can see that's either myself or my EVA partner. And the whole landscape looks like as if you're on Mars, just these sprawling red vistas of rock. Yeah, that one's me. So, and it's just, these amazing landscapes. There's lunar analogs. So there's more and more of these cropping up across the world now. There's ones in Poland, in Hawaii, in Iceland now. And so this is one from our planetary geology course. So we actually went to Cinder Lake in Arizona, where the Apollo astronauts did their training. And basically what NASA did in the 60s is they took explosives and detonated them and created these crater-like formations to reflect the moonscape, and then had the astronauts practice their geological excursions in these environments in their EVA suits. And there's actually really cool footage out there of the astronauts operating their jetpacks and practicing Cinder Lake. So we performed geologic field work out there. And we, in fact, took the lessons learned from Apollo and how the astronauts struggled with both the design of the spacesuits as well as the design of the tools. So if you look into it, there's some good papers out there that the center of gravity of these spacesuits were very non-favorable. They didn't allow the astronauts to use their waist, to bend at the knees. They wasted a lot of energy. Their center of gravity was off. It was very hard to grip tools. The tools weren't well-fashioned. So we took those lessons learned and built upon them to design our own geologic tools and test them in a similar setting. Okay. We don't need to necessarily replicate Moon or Mars, but we can also practice and build upon crew dynamics in operational environments. So this is a snapshot from one of our 2017 campaigns. This is actually in High Level, Alberta. we were testing out a brand new tomography instrument to get more information about a cloud thought to be related to climate change called a noctilucent cloud. So it's a very highly changing environment. This is an unpressurized aircraft at 19,000 feet. We need oxygen to keep ourselves breathing. There were a lot of mosquitoes, and what was really satisfying is once you go above a certain altitude, the mosquitoes just fall comatose. But then they come back to life when they come back to Earth. So it's very limited satisfaction. So I was the payload specialist. My job was to make sure that this camera was operating and focused on the noctilucent clouds. The mission specialist kept us on our trajectory, and then the research pilot, of course, was flying the plane. So we need to make sure that our oxygen is flowing, that we're on task, that we have the same model of what our objectives are, and same shared model for success. And then we don't need to necessarily go out to the middle of nowhere. Sometimes we can take resources away and simulate a resource-limited environment in that fashion. So that's what we do in my space medicine course. We take all comers, regardless of medical background or not, and we teach them essentially principles of wilderness medicine and working in a resource-limited environment to become a space medical MacGyver. So basically, if you have a broken leg, you don't have any medical supplies, what can you use around you as your disposal to treat it, for example? Okay. And so there's increasing research around how we maintain standards in these analog environments. So here is an example of a paper from 2021 that kind of points to that. Okay, I'm going to pause here as we move into the next section. Any other questions? Guys are a quiet bunch. Okay, so then let's come back and look at the big picture in the 15 or so minutes that are left to us, 10 or so minutes that are left to us, okay? Let's talk about what is the gold standard as we look towards sending humans to the moon, Mars, and beyond, okay? The ideal would be to provide the same standard of care on Mars as we do on Earth. So if we had no limitations, if we just ignored all the constraints we talked about, how do we do that? It would be by terraforming Mars into Earth, so we have same gravity, we have an atmosphere, we have habitable humidity, temperature confines, we don't have to worry about wearing a protective spacesuit, we can filter out that radiation. That would be nice. That is not the reality. So then let's ask a different question. What if we not just met the standard of care on Mars, so that it met the same standard as on Earth, but what if we surpass that? So how do we do that? Why don't we look to inspiration from science fiction? What if we could mitigate the deleterious effects of partial gravity, of zero gravity, by creating a spinning space station, just like in Space Odyssey 2001? What if we could mitigate the muscle and bone density loss by having an exoskeleton that allowed astronauts to perform meaningful work? What if we said, well, that radiation environment is still too high risk, so why don't we just create avatars of ourselves to go into that high risk environment? What if we could upload all the skills to our brains so we didn't lose those skills, just like in the Matrix? Or what if we said, 6 to 9 months is a really long time to be in transit, why don't we just teleport to Mars? So the future is closer than we think. We're going to talk a lot more about this in depth in the VR lecture. But VR is used very much in space today for skills training. Our work with Luxonic has created modules for the Canadian Space Agency for astronauts to practice medical procedures on long duration missions. You'll get to try some of those out. We've also created a virtual reality radiology reading room to be able to view images in VR so you don't have to bring those big screens with you. We will keep this video for the next lecture. Hopefully it's not trying to play. And here's a snapshot of one of our VR modules for the moon. We've tested this out in zero gravity and parabolic flight. Moving on from VR, let's talk a little bit about genetic engineering. So if you're sending astronauts into this high radiation, high risk environment, maybe the ethical argument is, shouldn't you prepare your astronauts as much as possible and keep them safe from this environment? So this is a really cool review from the MIT review in 2017 where they make exactly that argument. And they talk about splicing elephant genes into astronauts eventually, not to make a half human, half elephant hybrid, but because elephants typically don't get cancer because they have so many copies of onco-editing genes. So the argument there is, well, if you're sending them into a high radiation environment where they're prone to DNA damage, then you should also level the playing field by giving them more copies of cancer editing genes. This is a snapshot of the Rodent Research 19 experiment, which came back from the ISS in 2020. And basically they took genetically engineered mice and said, well, if they have more muscle mass to begin with, this is this jacked up little mouse here versus the wild type non-mutant component, how do they do with respect to muscle and bone density loss? So they had something called the ACVR2 neuromuscular blockade. And of course, the mutant mice fared better than the non-mutant mice, both in ground-informed studies. So they had less bone density loss, and in some cases increased more muscle mass than when they started. So NASA, the future is closer than we think when it comes to genetic engineering. NASA is literally engineering Mighty Mouse. Okay, so building on this concept of gene synthesis and precision medicine, this is coming to space now. This actually just came across my radar in the past week here. I haven't gone through the entirety of the paper yet, but this is for your own interest. Remember in the first lecture we talked about how personalized and precision medicine is coming to earthbound medicine. Well, now it's coming to space, so the review is here for your interest. AI in space. So we've seen it in science fiction. We've seen it behaving badly with HAL 9000 and Space Odyssey 2001. We've seen it be somewhat helpful with TARS and Interstellar. So NASA is looking at AI applications for astronaut health. They've been looking at it for a number of years now. And really interestingly enough, one of the devices, the biomonitoring devices, is a Canadian innovation. Uses AI as a predictive model for looking at heart signals and when they might be clinically relevant. So there's a cool tie there. David Saint-Jacques, the Canadian astronaut, wore it on station in winter of 2018. We actually did the testing for this device in parabolic flight in October of 2018, right before it went up. So here's what that setup looks like. This headband monitors pulse oximetry. We're looking at heart rate variability as well. Okay, 3D printing has applications in space. The first 3D printer made it to space in 2010 through the company called Made in Space, which is a very apt name. So then what can we use 3D printing for in space? We can use it for non-medical applications like printing clothes, printing food, printing habitats. We can use it for medical applications, and in fact, in the past few months, the researchers have done exactly that. The ISS National Lab published this from Redwire Space. They successfully printed human meniscus, so cartilage from the knees. There's also work being done to 3D print heart cells and send them to deep space to see how heart cells fare in a high radiation environment. So 3D printing for medicine is coming to space. All right, so we're talking about making science fiction reality. So let's talk about partial gravity, artificial gravity rotating space stations. This is not just a theoretical concept, and it's not just science fiction. So I mentioned before, I'm medical strategic research advisor to Above Space Development Corporation. So this is a company that is literally building a rotating space station. And how we generate gravity is a matter of simple physics. So it is the rate of rotation squared, or the angular momentum, times the radius. So there are trade-offs. If your radius is too small, you have to spin very fast to be able to generate an amount of partial gravity. You're going to feel that, and there's going to be nefarious effects. Whereas if you build a much bigger radius, you can spin slower, but then you're also spending a lot more time and effort with that construction. So this is Above Space is working on this, VAST is working on this. So there's a couple companies working on this. So what we know from the health and medicine side is that this could solve some problems for what we know that microgravity does to the human body. It can help prepare us for the moon and Mars if we can conduct these studies closer to Earth and also take out the radiation effect component. But it's not completely without its own confounding factors. So when we talk about artificial gravity, we also need to talk about the physics of how that affects the human body. So basically that's summarized as gravitational cross-coupling acceleration, Coriolis accelerations, and head-to-foot gradient. So here's a really good review on both from Above Space and then also a good review from Nature Microgravity on what those exactly mean. But to just give you an example, when we talk about the head-to-foot gradient, if the radius of your space station is 1 meter, and you're standing on the surface of that space station, you're adding another meter. So you're going to feel the difference in gravity from rotating at your feet versus your head. That's going to be effects. Whereas if you have a 10-kilometer space station, you adding 1 meter is probably not going to have that much of an effect. Gravitational cross-coupling, so there is, when you turn your head in a gravity gradient, your inner ear is going to feel that. So what about, now as we get more sci-fi, what about human hibernation for space travel? Well, the European Space Agency is working on this. They did some computer modeling in 2019 and a follow-up study in last year, 2022 maybe, looking at, well, if we could have humans hibernate in a 6 to 9 month journey to the red planet, what would that save us in terms of resources? And they calculated that you might actually be able to have a volume of your spacecraft that is 1/3 smaller because you're using less resources. So there's actually comparative physiology studies out there, institutes out there that are looking at, well, how can we bring that into humans? So the Alaska Biology Institute famously was looking at how can we make non-hibernating species hibernate. Ground squirrels hibernate. They can bring their basal metabolic rate down by 99%, which is great in terms of resource utilization, food, water utilization. So they said, can we do the same thing to rats? And they did. They were able to induce hibernation in rats. However, they had some side effects like decreased blood flow to the gut. As a consequence, the guts burst, causing sepsis and then death in the rats. So they have some things to figure out. Okay, and what if, I'm sure some of you are saying, well, this is a lot of work. Why don't we just go to Mars faster? So there are concepts out there for faster transportation engines. This is the Casimir plasma engine going from Earth to Mars in 39 days rather than 6 to 9 months. So you could mitigate the bone density loss, the muscle mass loss, the fluid shifts as well. So this is all to say that to get to space, we're going to have to science the space out of this. Now I know we're low on time here. In fact, we're at time. So what I want to do here is just skip the next section. This talks about what's next in space medicine. It talks about the horizons of emerging technologies, emerging problems, new curriculums in space medicine and space medicine fellowships that have cropped up in the US in the past year or so. And then it also talks about unsolved challenges. And it also talks about commercial space, sending non-space agency astronauts to space, as well as applications for terrestrial medicine on Earth. So again, this is more for interest. All of this is for interest except for what I highlighted on the exam. But feel free to use those in your exam answers. So I'm going to pause there. Any questions at all? No. It was either so good or so bad that you have nothing to say. I'm gonna perfect. So I'm gonna pause there for today. If you have any questions, just email, talk to me after class, and then I think I'm back sometime in early February to run the immersive medicine lecture. So thank you all for your attention, and see you next time.
Great.